For my reviews of the Marantz and Lyngdorf CD player and integrated amplifier combos, I used the speakers that you see behind me. They are the Bowers & Wilkins 703 S3, and today we review those loudspeakers.
This episode is brought to you by AudioQuest, makers of the mythical series Analog Interconnects. Click the link in the show notes for more information.
Welcome back everybody. Yes, the 703 S3 is part of Bowers & Wilkins's or B&W's 700 series, and above it sit the 800 series, and below it sit the 600 series, 600, 700, 800. And we're talking about a floor stander in the 700 series today. Now S3 means that this is the third version to date of the 703 floor stander. And I gotta say, it's exquisitely made. This is such a beautifully made loudspeaker in terms of fit and finish. It's a three-way, and I think it's the most affordable floor stander in the 700 series that features the tweeter on top. Yes, the 1-inch carbon dome tweeter sits in its own enclosure, decoupled from the main loudspeaker cabinet, so that I think it cannot be disturbed by vibrations coming from the other drivers that sit in the main part of the cabinet. And that tweeter sits in a long tapered aluminium tube. If you're American, you get the aluminum version, and basically it's designed to take away as much of the back wave of the tweeter as possible. And that in turn has the knock-on effect of reducing distortion from the tweeter's forward output. And the front baffle on the 703 S3 is gently curved to make it look good and also to quieten it so that it doesn't reflect as much sound as say previous generations of the 703, which I think had a flat front baffle. And mounted to the top of that front baffle is a dedicated 6-inch mid-range driver. And B&W call this driver a decoupled continuum cone fixed suspension transducer. God, what a mouthful that is. And if you're wondering what continuum is, as I did, I looked it up, and basically it's a material that Bowers & Wilkins assert is better behaved in terms of breakup modes than the Kevlar used in the S2 version. And inside the cabinet on the back of the mid-range driver, instead of a usual spider, Bowers & Wilkins have put something called a biomimetic suspension system, which is essentially, it works like the spider. It allows the driver to flex but keep it in place. And yeah, I think Bowers & Wilkins just think that that's better than a normal spider. And below that mid-range driver, we get two 6.5-inch aerofoil profile bass drivers. And they are augmented by a reflex port which sits on the back. And together they give us low frequency action down to 46 Hertz. Other vital statistics of this loudspeaker include a 90 dB sensitivity rating and an 8 ohm nominal impedance rating. Okay, so how does a pair of 703 S3 actually sound? Well, being as this is a tall loudspeaker, you will not be surprised to learn that the sound staging on this speaker is also very tall, because the tweeter sits higher, I think, than most speakers that I've heard. And the Bowers are quite a bit taller than the outgoing Zusol 6, and they're sharper with their image focus to boot. Bass isn't overcooked here. It's neither underdone nor overdone in my 7 meter by 4 meter room here. I think maybe, possibly, I'm guessing, the bass might be a bit too much for my Berlin apartment, which is only 6 meters by 5 meters, but generally it feels like a smaller space acoustically and visually. And yeah, I guess this brings me to an issue really with reviews in general, is that if I don't mention something, it really means that it was neither a standout nor a disappointment. So I don't really have a lot to say about the bass itself from these loudspeakers, other than it's perfectly fine and just the right amount for this room. Probably the best way I can describe it is it's nondescript, and I mean that as a compliment. Now, just for kicks, and just because I have the TDAI-3400 from Lyngdorf here, I added a pair of Golden Ear Force Field 30 subwoofers to the system. And I concluded that really you don't need those subwoofers with these loudspeakers. Well, maybe you do, if you want to have access or better access to the sub bass that sits between 20 and 40. But I would not say it's essential. However, if you have a smaller room, then maybe subs are more useful to you because you can dial them in, but you can locate the bass where you want it. So you take it away from the loudspeaker if you're high passing the loudspeaker, and then hand off the low frequency or the super low frequency duties to the sub and move it around and place it in the room where you think it sounds best. And then you can also adjust its amplitude. So in many ways, I think subwoofers are of more use in smaller rooms than bigger ones. Because a room like this, which is quite large acoustically, because I've got a big sort of hallway here and a big hallway there, I don't have to worry about bass build-up or bass pressure in this room as much as I do in a smaller room like that I have in Germany. So if I had these loudspeakers in Germany, what I would do, I would take something like the Lyngdorf and I would room perfect in a pair of subwoofers so I can adjust them and tune the whole thing to the room. However, I did take a quick measurement of what room perfect did to the loudspeakers and the sub. And even though I wasn't necessarily convinced, as I said previously, that the subs were necessary, what Room Perfect did in the uppermost frequencies was quite interesting because it lifted a tiny dip between 2 kilohertz and 4 kilohertz and then brought down a slight peak at 9 kilohertz. And that's because we cannot talk about the 703 S3 without really talking about how the tweeter on top dominates proceedings. And I don't mean that in a bad way. You see, these Bowers & Wilkins loudspeakers don't give us a sort of laid back, easy breezy, warm kind of sound. In fact, I would say that the top end here is energized to the point that it's easily provoked or would be easily provoked by the wrong amplifier or the wrong source components. And therefore it needs very careful amplifier matching or very judicious use of EQ if your amplifier isn't quite the right fit for the loudspeakers. Now, if you want a simple amplifier solution that sounds just perfect out of the box, you want the Marantz Model 30. I didn't need to EQ it at all. Its sort of warmer, richer, fuller presentation is a splendid match for the 703 S3. And it strikes the right balance between the sort of lean back kind of listening and the edge of the seat lean forward kind of listening. But if you have a crisper, cleaner sounding amplifier like the Lyngdorf TDAI-3400, then you're going to want to get intimate with its DSP possibilities. But once you get the right amp or the right DSP settings or the right room correction settings, oh boy, because we get laser guided delivery of instrument placement on the soundstage, but also a much cleaner look at the spaces between instruments, which I think is quite rare. For example, if you take the track Very, Very Hungry from David Byrne and Brian Eno's My Life in the Bush of Ghosts and listen to the first minute and see on your system if you can track all that's going on, like sounds that start over here and then whoosh over here. That was a terrible sound effect, wasn't it? But basically just moving around, because there is a distinct whoosh sound that moves at around the 39-second mark. And with the Bowers & Wilkins, I can really hear where that starts and where that finishes. And whilst you're listening to the rest of that track, ask yourself, do you hear the high life guitar and the stuttering vocal samples drive forward the track from a rhythmic point of view? Because when I listen to that track on these loudspeakers, that's exactly what I hear. Now, as regular viewers will know, I almost never listen to jazz, but when I do, it's generally a track like Dropping Bombs on the White House from the Style Council, which is on a compilation that they put out a few years ago. It's the last track on the first disc, it's an extended version, and it's pure jazz. And the layer separation that I hear on that track from the Bowers & Wilkins floor standards is just magic. And moving over to New Order's Technique, which I think is their best album, we get a tremendously clean delivery of detail. Because if you hadn't guessed already, this is also, because that present tweeter on top, it's a very detailed sounding loudspeaker. What about criticisms? Because I do have a couple. I do think that the 703 S3 sound a little bit cool when playing that Style Council jazz track. And sometimes they come up short on macro dynamic punch, just a little bit. At least that's how I hear it when I compare the Bowers & Wilkins to the Zoo Soul 6. To me, the Zoo sound a little bit warmer, they aren't quite as resolving in the top end, and they don't serve up the bass textures, we'll come back to this in a minute, with quite as much detail as the Bowers & Wilkins. However, the Zoo aced the Bowers & Wilkins on macro dynamic, argy-bargy and overall punch, and I think tonally they're a bit better too, especially with something like Neil Young's Unplugged album. I much prefer listening to that through the Zoos than through these Bowers, because I don't know, I just think the tone of the Zoo speakers is a better fit for that sort of acoustic guitar dominated presentation or performance that Young and his band give us on that album. And that might be because the Zoo Soul 6 tend to hook the listener with mid-range palpability. And the Bowers & Wilkins don't work that way. Their hook lies higher up the frequency spectrum. That's where they really grab your attention. Maybe just a little bit higher than where the Zoo push the sound into the room more. Maybe upper mid-range, lower treble. But the Bowers & Wilkins' tweeter clarity also furnishes us with benefits that you possibly wouldn't expect and that lie elsewhere. For example, if I'm listening to something like Purple Mountains' debut and only album from 2019, I think the Bowers & Wilkins put more grit and gravel into David Berman's voice, and I like that. And in a similar manner, we also hear more of the surface textures of the bass notes that introduce us to New Order's Fine Time. But please don't think that the Bowers & Wilkins 703 S3 are bright or exhausting to listen to, because they're not, because with the right amp or the right EQ settings, I can really drive Bowie's Heathen from 2002 up to very high volume levels and just sit there and just bask in the glory and not feel worn down by it at all. And I was expecting the 703 S3 to be annoying at higher volumes, and they're not. But if we go the other way, if we take the lights down and the volume down, especially late at night, the Bowers are excellent for watching TV late at night, because the clarity that they bring to vocals and therefore dialogue is just so good. And it also means that I can hear every single subtlety in the enunciation brought by Paddy McAloon to Jordan the Comeback by Prefab Sprout. So I can hear all the sort of the vocal twists and turns in that album, but at low listening levels. And that surprised me as well. And all of these tweeter on top derived qualities really do become highly addictive over time. I learned a valuable lesson in making this video and doing this review, because for years in my head I thought, I don't like Bowers & Wilkins loudspeakers, you know, that's where my inner grump comes out or came out. And that opinion was formed on the back of one afternoon listening to, I think, a 600 series stand mount in about 2012. And I've carried that with me for 10 years. And I bet you've done that with maybe another brand's equipment or just another kind of format. You might think you don't like vinyl because you had a bad experience 10 years ago. And I think it's important for all of us to update our thinking on a regular basis. Here's a good one, Class D amplifiers. If you're sitting there thinking, I don't like Class D amplifiers, you know, they sound really hard and cold and they have a recessed mid-range, ask yourself, when was the last time you really sat down and listened to not just one, but maybe 2 or 3 Class D amplifiers from this decade? Because then you are entitled to maintain your opinion as it was before, but you never know, your opinion might change, either because you change or because the tech has gotten better. And for me, I don't know whether the tech has gotten better, I would assume it has. I mean, it's hard for me to kind of compare my experience back in 2012 with my experience here in 2023, because back then it was a stand mount without a tweeter on top, and here it is a floor stander with a tweeter on top. But yeah, I think it's important that we don't hold on to, I guess, rigid opinions for our entire lives, or certainly not for 10 years, because that's absurd. Anyway, I hope you liked this video. I hope you found it informative or entertaining or a bit of both. If you did, please give us a like down below. And if you like my attitude towards expensive hi-fi gear, even if you can't afford it and you're watching just for fun, then please consider subscribing to this channel. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching. Hello, me again. You can probably hear in this video that I've got a bit of a head and chest cold at the moment. I'm kind of almost losing my voice. So there are plenty of outtakes to be seen from this video. And that version of this video is only available on Patreon. And the Patreon version of this video also features around 4 minutes of me kind of rambling on about the music used to review the Bowers & Wilkins 703 S3.